The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a footman whose livery was so immaculate that Martha Evermere nearly dropped her teacup at the sight of him standing in their modest drawing-room. The cream-coloured envelope bore a seal that every household in London and the surrounding counties recognized instantly, the Blackwood crest pressed into deep crimson wax, announcing without words that its contents came from none other than the Duke of Ashworth himself. "Good heavens," Mrs. Evermere whispered, her hand trembling as she accepted the envelope. "Good heavens, Harold, do you see this?" Harold Evermere, a man of modest fortune and even more modest ambitions, set down his morning paper and adjusted his spectacles. He was a gentleman in every sense, kind, well-read, and hopelessly content with their quiet country existence, but even he could not ignore the significance of that crimson seal. "Open it, my dear," he said, though his voice carried an unusual tremor. "Don't keep us in suspense." Their daughter Marian sat by the window with a book in her lap, though her eyes had lifted from the page the moment the footman entered. At 22, she possessed a beauty that was often described as unconventional, dark hair that refused to hold its pins, grey eyes that seemed to see through pretense, and a mouth that curved more readily into thoughtful expressions than empty smiles. She watched her mother break the seal with the same detached curiosity. She might offer a particularly interesting passage in her novel. "It is an invitation," Mrs. Evermere breathed, her eyes scanning the elegant script. "To the Duke of Ashworth's Christmas dinner. The Christmas dinner, Harold, at Blackwood Manor." The silence that followed was profound. The Evermeres were respectable, certainly. Harold's family had held their small estate for generations, and Martha came from equally unremarkable but honourable stock. They attended local assemblies, maintained cordial relationships with their neighbours, and had never in all their years received an invitation from anyone of such elevated status. "There must be some mistake," Harold said slowly. "There is no mistake." Mrs. Evermere's voice had taken on a quality that Marian recognized all too well, the breathless excitement of a woman who suddenly saw possibilities where none had existed before. "It says the Evermere family quite clearly. We are invited to the most prestigious social event of the season." Marian returned her attention to her book, though she could not have recited a single word on the page. She knew what was coming, could feel it in the way her mother's gaze had shifted to rest upon her with renewed calculation. The Duke of Ashworth's Christmas dinner was legendary. Each year, the most influential families in the region gathered at Blackwood Manor for an evening of unparalleled elegance. Alliances were formed, matches were made, and fortunes were secured within those ancient walls. An invitation was not merely an honor. It was an opportunity that could transform a family's social standing overnight. And this year, for reasons no one in the Evermere household could fathom, they had been included. "We shall need new gowns," Mrs. Evermere was saying, already planning. "And we must prepare our responses carefully. The dinner is in 3 weeks, which gives us adequate time. I don't wish to attend." The words left Marian's mouth before she had fully considered them, though she found upon reflection that she meant them completely. Her parents turned to stare at her with identical expressions of disbelief. "I beg your pardon?" her mother said. Marian closed her book and met their gazes steadily. "I have no interest in attending the Duke's dinner. You and Father should go, of course, but I would prefer to remain home." The teacup clattered against its saucer as Mrs. Evermere set it down with unnecessary force. "Have you gone mad? This is the opportunity of a lifetime. Do you have any idea how many young women would give anything to receive such an invitation?" "Then perhaps one of them should have received it instead," Marian replied calmly. Harold Evermere removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture he employed when attempting to navigate the increasingly frequent disagreements between his wife and daughter. "Marian, surely you understand the significance." "I understand perfectly, Father. I understand that we have received this invitation through some accident or oversight, and that attending would place us in a room full of people who will look upon us with confusion at best and contempt at worst. I understand that Mother hopes I will catch the eye of some wealthy gentleman who will elevate our family's position. And I understand that I have no desire to participate in such a performance." Her words were not cruel. They were simply honest, delivered with the quiet conviction that had always set Marian apart from other young women of her acquaintance. She had endured 3 London seasons at her mother's insistence, each one more tedious than the last. She had danced with fortune hunters and second sons, had smiled through endless conversations about hunting and horses and the weather, had pretended interest in men who had never once asked her opinion on anything of substance, and she was tired of it. "You are being ridiculous," Mrs. Evermere said sharply. "You will attend, and that is final." "Martha," Harold said gently, "perhaps we should not force the issue. If Marian truly does not wish, she will attend. This is not a matter for discussion." Marian rose from her seat by the window, her book held against her chest like a shield. "I am 22 years old, Mother. I have sat through countless dinners and balls and entertainments, all in service of a goal I do not share. I have no interest in marriage for its own sake, and I certainly have no interest in parading myself before a duke and his guests like a horse at auction." "Marian," her mother's face had gone quite red, "you will not speak so." "I will decline the invitation," Marian continued, her voice steady. "You and Father may attend and make whatever excuses you wish for my absence, but I will not go." She left the room before either parent could respond, climbing the stairs to her bedchamber with measured steps. Behind her, she could hear her mother's voice rising in agitation, her father's quieter tones attempting to soothe. She closed her door against the sound and moved to her own window, looking out at the winter-grey landscape that surrounded their home. She had not meant to cause such upheaval. Truthfully, the refusal had emerged almost without thought, a reaction born of years of suppressed frustration. But now that she had spoken, she found she had no desire to take the words back. What was the Duke of Ashworth to her? A name spoken with reverence by people who valued titles above character. A man she had never met, whose invitation had arrived like a command from on high, expecting her immediate and grateful compliance. She would not comply. The decision felt like freedom. 3 days later, the household had settled into an uneasy truce. Mrs. Evermere had alternated between cold silence and passionate appeals, neither of which had swayed her daughter's resolve. Harold Evermere had retreated to his study, unwilling to take sides in a battle he knew he could not win, and Marian had continued her quiet existence, reading, walking in the gardens despite the cold, helping their housekeeper with preparations for the Christmas season. The response had been sent to Blackwood Manor, with appropriate regrets and vague references to prior engagements. Marian had not asked what excuse her parents had given, and they had not offered to tell her. A fragile peace had descended upon the Evermere home, built on the foundation of carefully avoided topics. It was shattered on the 4th day. Marian was in the small library that served as her refuge when she heard the commotion. First came the sound of hoofbeats on the drive, unusual as they rarely received callers, followed by a knock at the front door that seemed to echo through the entire house. Then came voices, one of which she recognized as their butler's, raised in unmistakable alarm. She set down her book and moved to the doorway, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. From her vantage point, she could see the front hall where her father stood with his mouth hanging open, in a most undignified manner, and her mother clutched the banister as though she might faint without its support. And in the center of it all, filling the modest space with a presence that seemed almost too large for their small home, stood a man unlike any Marian had ever seen. He was tall, exceptionally so, with broad shoulders that strained against the exquisite cut of his dark coat. His hair was the color of midnight, shot through with the barest threads of silver at the temples, and his face possessed the sharp, aristocratic beauty of centuries of careful breeding. But it was his eyes that arrested her attention, pale blue, almost silver in the winter light streaming through the windows, and fixed upon her father with an intensity that made something in Marian's chest tighten. "I am Duke Magnus Blackwood," he said, and his voice was exactly as she might have imagined it, deep and resonant, accustomed to command. "And I have come to inquire why my invitation was refused." The silence that followed was absolute. Marian watched her father's face cycle through several expressions, shock, terror, confusion, before settling on something that resembled a fish gasping for air. "Your Grace," Harold finally managed. That is to say, the honor." I cannot possibly express. You can express it by explaining the refusal, the Duke said. His tone was not unkind, but neither did it offer any quarter. I have hosted the Christmas dinner at Blackwood Manor for 12 years. In that time, no one has ever declined my invitation. I find myself curious as to what circumstances could possibly warrant such an unprecedented response. Mrs. Evermere had recovered enough to descend the stairs, her hand still trembling against the banister. Your Grace, please forgive us. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. We never intended to give offence, yet offence was given, whether intended or not. The Duke's gaze swept the hall, taking in the modest furnishings, the slightly worn carpet, the faded portrait hanging on the wall. I am not accustomed to being refused, Mrs. Evermere. I find I would like to understand. It was at that moment that Marian stepped fully into view. She had not planned to reveal herself. Indeed, the sensible course would have been to retreat to her library and allow her parents to smooth over the situation with whatever platitudes and apologies they deemed necessary. But something in the Duke's words, the arrogance of them, the assumption that his invitation was something no reasonable person could possibly decline, sparked a flame of indignation that overrode her usual caution. The circumstances, she said clearly, are that I did not wish to attend. Every eye in the hall turned to her. Her mother's face had gone the colour of chalk. Her father looked as though he might genuinely collapse. But it was the Duke's reaction that held her attention. The slight widening of those pale eyes, the almost imperceptible tilt of his head, as though he had encountered something unexpected and was attempting to categorize it. "And you are?" he asked. "Marian Evermere, the one who refused your invitation." She descended the remaining stairs with deliberate calm, acutely aware of the picture she must present, her hair already escaping its pins, her dress a simple morning gown of pale blue muslin, her feet bare of the slippers she had abandoned somewhere in the library. She looked nothing like the polished young women who undoubtedly graced the Duke's ballroom, and she found she did not care. "Miss Evermere," the Duke said slowly, and something in his tone had shifted. "You are the author of my disappointment. If your disappointment stems from a single declined invitation, Your Grace, then perhaps your standards for disappointment are somewhat low." She heard her mother's sharp intake of breath, saw her father close his eyes in what could only be despair. But she held the Duke's gaze without flinching, determined to make him understand that she was not one of the simpering debutantes who hung upon his every word. For a long moment, Magnus Blackwood simply looked at her. Then, to the astonishment of everyone present, he laughed. It was not a mocking laugh nor a cruel one. It was genuine, a rich, warm sound that seemed entirely at odds with his imposing presence. It transformed his face, softening the sharp planes, crinkling the corners of those remarkable eyes. "Miss Evermere," he said when his laughter had subsided, "I believe I begin to understand why my invitation was refused. It was not, I suspect, a matter of prior engagements." "No," she admitted. "It was not." "Then may I ask what matter it was?" The question was posed with genuine curiosity, stripped of the arrogance that had coloured his earlier words. Marian found herself momentarily wrong-footed by the shift. "It was a matter of preference," she said finally. "I have attended many dinners and balls and social entertainments over the past several years. I have found them tedious beyond measure. I saw no reason to believe your event would be any different. Another woman might have softened the words, wrapped them in flattery to blunt their edge. Marian offered them plainly, as she offered everything, without artifice or pretense." The Duke's expression was unreadable. "You believe my Christmas dinner would be tedious. I believe all such events are tedious. I mean no particular offence to yours. And yet, particular offence is what I have taken." He paused, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "Tell me, Miss Evermere, what would make such an event less tedious in your estimation?" The question surprised her. She had expected anger or dismissal, or at the very least the cold hauteur that men of his station typically employed when confronted with opinions they found unacceptable. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in her answer. "Honest conversation," she said after a moment's thought. "People who speak of substance rather than fashion and weather and the latest gossip An atmosphere that values intelligence over artifice. She met his eyes squarely. I have yet to encounter such an event in polite society. Then you have been attending the wrong events. Or perhaps I have simply been attending them with the wrong expectations. The Duke considered this. Around them, Marian was dimly aware of her parents standing frozen in place, uncertain how to navigate a conversation that had veered so far from any social script they might have anticipated. I find myself at an impasse, the Duke said finally. Your refusal has wounded my pride, Miss Evermere. I came here expecting to receive an apology and a reversal of your decision. Instead, I have received neither. I am sorry to disappoint you, Your Grace. Are you? The question held a note of challenge. I rather think you are not. I think you are quite pleased with yourself for speaking so plainly to a man of my station. Marian felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the accuracy of his observation. I am not accustomed to tempering my words based on the rank of my audience. No, I can see that you are not. He took a step closer, and she became acutely aware of how tall he was, how his presence seemed to fill the space around him. It is a most unusual quality in a young woman, most unusual indeed. I am not most young women. No, he agreed, and his voice had softened in a way that made her pulse quicken despite herself. I am beginning to suspect that you are not. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them seemed charged with something Marian could not name, a tension that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with the way his eyes held hers, searching for something she was not certain she wished him to find. It was her mother who broke the spell, stepping forward with hands clasped tightly before her. Your Grace, please, I must apologize for my daughter's impertinence. She has always been headstrong, but I assure you she means no disrespect. On the contrary, Mrs. Evermere. The Duke did not look away from Marian as he spoke. I find your daughter's candor refreshing. It has been some time since anyone has spoken to me without the varnish of flattery and false deference. You mistake plain speaking for something more romantic than it is, Marian said. I simply see no purpose in dissembling. And I see no purpose in continuing to stand in your entrance hall like an unwelcome tradesman. The Duke's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. Perhaps you might offer me tea, and we can continue this most enlightening conversation in more comfortable surroundings. It was not a request. Though his words were framed politely, there was no mistaking the expectation beneath them. And yet, oddly, Marian did not find herself bristling at the presumption, as she might have expected. There was something in his manner that suggested genuine interest, rather than mere aristocratic entitlement. Or perhaps she was simply curious to see what he would do next. Of course, Your Grace, her father said hastily, finally finding his voice. Please, come through to the drawing room. Martha, perhaps you might see to refreshments. Mrs. Evermere hurried away, no doubt grateful for an excuse to compose herself, and Harold led the Duke through to their modest drawing room with an anxiety that bordered on comical. Marian followed at a more measured pace, her mind working furiously to understand why a man of such consequence would bother to pursue a slight that any reasonable person would have simply overlooked. The drawing room looked smaller than usual with the Duke standing in it. He surveyed the space with those keen eyes, taking in the worn but comfortable furniture, the shelves of books that lined one wall, the pianoforte in the corner that had been Marian's grandmother's. If he found their home wanting in comparison to his own grand estate, he gave no sign of it. You have a fine collection, he observed, gesturing toward the bookshelves. Unusual for a country home of this size. My daughter is a voracious reader, Harold said, sinking into a chair with evident relief. She has been since childhood. I'm afraid I've indulged her appetite for books rather shamelessly. There is no shame in the pursuit of knowledge, Mr. Evermere. The Duke settled into a chair across from Harold, somehow making the modest seat appear as grand as a throne. It is, I would argue, the only pursuit of true value. Marian, who had taken her customary position by the window, felt something shift in her assessment of the man before her. It was not a sentiment she had expected from a duke, particularly one whose reputation suggested a life consumed by social obligations and political maneuverings. You are surprised, he observed, his gaze finding hers with unnerving accuracy. You did not expect me to value learning. I did not expect you to value anything beyond your own consequence. Marianne! Her father's voice carried a note of genuine alarm. You must forgive her, Your Grace. I must do nothing of the kind. The Duke's eyes never left her face. Your daughter speaks her mind, Mr. Evermere. It is a quality I find I admire, even when, perhaps especially when, the words are aimed at me. There was something in the way he said it, a warmth beneath the words that suggested he meant them sincerely. Marianne felt an unfamiliar flutter of uncertainty, the ground beneath her assumptions shifting in ways she had not anticipated. You cannot admire being insulted, she said. Can I not? In my experience, Miss Evermere, the truth is far more valuable than comfort, and you, it seems, deal only in truth, only in... Her mother returned then with the tea service, and for the next several minutes the conversation turned to more conventional topics. The weather, the approaching Christmas season, the state of the roads. Marianne participated only when addressed directly, content to observe the Duke as he charmed her parents, with an ease that spoke of long practice. And yet, even as he discussed matters of no consequence, his gaze would occasionally find hers across the room, as though they shared some secret that excluded everyone else. It was disconcerting, that attention, all the more so, because she found she did not entirely dislike it. When the tea had been drunk and the small talk exhausted, the Duke rose to take his leave. Marianne's parents rose with him, their relief barely concealed. But before he reached the door, he turned back to face the room. I find I have a proposition, he announced. Miss Evermere has informed me that she finds social gatherings tedious. She believes that my Christmas dinner will be no different from the countless other events she has endured and found wanting. Marianne's heart began to beat faster, though she could not have said why. I would like to prove her wrong. Your Grace, Mrs. Evermere's voice was barely above a whisper. I extend my invitation once more, not merely to the dinner itself, but to Blackwood Manor for the week preceding it. Miss Evermere will have ample opportunity to observe the preparations and to engage in the sort of substantive conversation she claims to value. His eyes met Marianne's, and there was something in them that looked almost like a challenge. If, at the end of the week, she still believes my gathering to be tedious and without merit, I will accept her assessment without protest. But I suspect, here the ghost of a smile crossed his features, that she may find her expectations confounded. The silence that followed his pronouncement was so complete that Marianne could hear the ticking of the clock on the mantel. A week at Blackwood Manor? Harold repeated faintly. That is most generous, Your Grace. It is not generosity, Mr. Evermere. It is curiosity. The Duke's gaze held Marianne's with an intensity that made her breath catch. Your daughter has piqued my interest. I find I would like to understand her better. And if I decline this new invitation as well, Marianne heard herself ask, then I shall be forced to accept that you are not merely honest, but also a coward, unwilling to put your convictions to the test. He inclined his head slightly. But somehow, Miss Evermere, I do not think you are a coward. It was a manipulation, and they both knew it. He was using her own pride against her, banking on the certainty that she would not allow such an accusation to stand. She should refuse. Every instinct of self-preservation urged her to decline his offer and return to the quiet safety of her books and her solitude. But he was right about one thing: she was not a coward. Very well, she said, the words emerging with a conviction she did not entirely feel. I accept your invitation. Something flickered in the Duke's eyes, triumph perhaps, or something warmer. Excellent, I shall send a carriage for you on Friday next. I suggest you bring your book, he added, and now there was definitely amusement in his voice. Something tells me you will want it. He departed with the same commanding presence with which he had arrived, leaving the Evermere household in a state of collective shock. Mrs. Evermere sank onto the nearest chair, fanning herself weakly. Harold stood motionless in the center of the room, staring at the door through which the Duke had vanished, and Marianne remained by the window, watching the Duke's elegant carriage disappear down the lane, wondering what precisely she had just agreed to, and why the prospect filled her with equal measures of dread and anticipation. The days that followed passed with agonizing slowness. Mrs. Evermere threw herself into preparations with a fervor that bordered on mania, dispatching letters to London for new gowns, consulting with every woman of her acquaintance on matters of etiquette and fashion, and subjecting Marian to endless lectures on proper behavior in elevated company. "You must not speak so freely," she insisted for the 100th time, watching as the seamstress pinned yet another length of silk around Marian's form. "The Duke may have found your impertinence amusing in our home, but Blackwood Manor will be filled with the finest families in England. You cannot simply say whatever comes into your head. Would you prefer I say nothing at all?" "I would prefer you conduct yourself with the grace and restraint befitting a young woman of good breeding." Her mother's eyes were sharp with warning. "This is an opportunity beyond anything we could have hoped for. Do not squander it with your peculiar notions of honesty." Marian held her tongue, though her thoughts were far less restrained. She understood what her mother hoped, that this unexpected association with the Duke would lead to advantageous connections, perhaps even a marriage proposal from some wealthy gentleman seeking a wife. What Mrs. Evermere did not understand was that Marian had no intention of playing the role of eager debutante, regardless of how fine her gowns or how elevated her companions. She would go to Blackwood Manor because she had given her word. She would engage in the Duke's challenge because she would not be called a coward. But she would not pretend to be something she was not, and she would not sacrifice her principles on the altar of social advancement. The seamstress finished her work, and Marian retreated to her library, the one space in the house where her mother's machinations could not reach her. She selected a volume of poetry from the shelf and settled into her favorite chair, attempting to lose herself in verse. But for the first time in memory, the words would not come alive on the page. Her thoughts kept drifting elsewhere, to pale blue eyes that had held hers with such unsettling intensity, to a voice that had spoken of truth and learning with unexpected reverence, to the challenge that had been issued and accepted. Duke Magnus Blackwood was not what she had expected. That realization troubled her more than she cared to admit. She had built her defenses against men of his station, the vain, the pompous, the self-important aristocrats who viewed women as ornaments to be collected and displayed. She knew how to parry their empty compliments and deflect their predictable advances. But the Duke had offered no compliments, empty or otherwise. He had met her directness with equal frankness, had seemed genuinely intrigued by her refusal rather than offended by it. It was possible, of course, that his interest was merely another form of conquest, that he saw her resistance as a challenge to be overcome, her eventually surrender as a prize to be won. Such men existed in abundance among the aristocracy, and the Duke's reputation certainly suggested a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. But there had been something in his eyes when he spoke of books and learning, something that hinted at depths she had not anticipated. And his laughter, genuine and unguarded, had revealed a man capable of finding humor in his own discomfiture. Marian closed her book with a sigh of frustration. She was allowing herself to be intrigued, and that way lay danger. She would go to Blackwood Manor. She would observe and assess. And at the end of the week she would confirm what she already knew, that the Duke, for all his unexpected qualities, was ultimately no different from every other man of her acquaintance. The carriage arrived on Friday morning as promised, just as the winter sun was breaking through the clouds. It was the finest vehicle Marian had ever seen, gleaming black lacquer, the Blackwood crest emblazoned in gold upon the doors, drawn by 4 perfectly matched horses, whose coats shone like polished mahogany. Her mother wept openly as she said goodbye, whether from joy or anxiety Marian could not tell. Her father embraced her quietly, his eyes conveying a message he could not speak aloud. "Be careful." "I will write," she promised, climbing into the carriage with as much composure as she could muster. The interior was as luxurious as she might have expected. Velvet cushions, fur throws against the cold, a small compartment stocked with refreshments for the journey. But Marian barely noticed her surroundings as the carriage lurched into motion, her attention fixed on the window and the familiar landscape that gradually gave way to countryside she had never seen. Blackwood Manor lay some 3 hours distant, and she used the time to gather her thoughts and fortify her resolve. Whatever awaited her at the Duke's estate, she would meet it with the same composure and honesty that had governed her conduct thus far. She would not be intimidated by grandeur, nor seduced by luxury, nor swayed by charm. She was Marian Evermere, and she knew her own mind. The manor came into view as the afternoon light was turning golden, a vast edifice of pale stone rising from manicured grounds like something from a dream. Wings stretched in either direction from a central structure crowned with towers, and countless windows glittered in the winter sun. Even from a distance, the scale of it was staggering. As the carriage wound its way up the long drive, Marian counted at least a dozen chimneys, sending plumes of smoke into the cold air. Gardens stretched as far as the eye could see, bare now in winter, but hinting at the splendor they must display in spring. A fountain stood before the main entrance, its waters still despite the cold, its marble figures posed in attitudes of classical grace. The carriage came to a halt, and a footman appeared immediately to hand her down. Her feet touched the gravel of the drive, and she forced herself to stand tall, to meet the grandeur around her without flinching. "Miss Evermere." His voice reached her before she saw him, and when she turned he was there, Duke Magnus Blackwood, standing at the top of the entrance stairs as though he had been waiting for her arrival. He wore no coat despite the cold, his white shirt open at the throat in a manner that was distinctly informal. His dark hair was slightly disordered, as though he had been running his hands through it, and there was a warmth in his expression that seemed at odds with everything she had heard of his reputation. "You came," he said, and the words carried a note of something that sounded almost like relief. "Did you doubt I would? I have learned not to make assumptions about you, Miss Evermere." He descended the stairs with an easy grace that spoke of perfect confidence. "I find you most unpredictable." She tilted her head, regarding him steadily. "And you find that appealing?" "I find it intriguing." He stopped before her, close enough that she could see the individual threads of silver in his dark hair. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation she took it. Together they climbed the stairs toward the great doors that stood open to receive her. Whatever happened next, Marian knew that her life would never be quite the same. Blackwood Manor exceeded every expectation Marian had carefully constructed and then dismissed as irrelevant. The entrance hall alone was larger than the entire ground floor of her family's home, a vast expanse of marble and gilt, with a sweeping staircase that curved upward like the spine of some magnificent creature. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Blackwoods gazing down with expressions ranging from stern disapproval to quiet amusement. "Your ancestors appear to be judging me," Marian observed as the Duke led her deeper into his domain. "They judge everyone. It is the privilege of the dead to look upon the living with perpetual disappointment." He glanced at her sidelong, and she caught the ghost of a smile on his lips. "You will grow accustomed to their scrutiny. I do not intend to remain long enough for that. We shall see." A housekeeper appeared as if summoned by magic, a formidable woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe knot and eyes that missed nothing. She introduced herself as Mrs. Thornwood and informed Marian that her rooms had been prepared in the east wing, where the morning light was particularly fine. "I took the liberty of assuming you would prefer quiet to proximity," the Duke said. "The other guests will be housed in the west wing when they arrive. You will have solitude for your reading." Marian looked at him sharply, surprised by the consideration. "You remembered." "I remember everything you have told me, Miss Evermere. It is not such a difficult feat when the words themselves are so memorable." Before she could formulate a response, Mrs. Thornwood was guiding her up the magnificent staircase and through a labyrinth of corridors. The east wing, when they reached it, proved to be everything the Duke had promised. A suite of rooms overlooking a frost-covered garden, furnished with understated elegance and blessed with the kind of profound silence that Marian had always craved. "Dinner is at 8, Mrs. Thornwood informed her. "His Grace requests the pleasure of your company in the library beforehand, if you are amenable. He thought you might wish to see the collection." The library. Despite her determination to remain unimpressed, Marian felt a flutter of genuine interest. "I am amenable." When Mrs. Thornwood had departed, Marian took stock of her surroundings with a more critical eye. The bedchamber was large and comfortable, dominated by a four-poster bed draped in deep blue velvet. A fire crackled in the hearth, warming the room against the December chill. Her trunk had already been unpacked, her few gowns hanging in the wardrobe like poor relations at a grand party. She moved to the window and looked out at the gardens below. Even in winter's grip they possessed a stark beauty, geometric hedges dusted with frost, bare trees standing sentinel against the grey sky, a frozen pond glittering in the afternoon light. It was a landscape designed to impress, to remind visitors of the wealth and power that had shaped it over centuries. And yet, there was something almost melancholy about it. Something lonely. Marian shook off the fanciful thought and turned to prepare for dinner. She had come here to prove a point, not to develop romantic notions about lonely dukes and their magnificent estates. The library took her breath away. She had expected grandeur. Blackwood Manor seemed incapable of anything less. But she had not anticipated the sheer scale of the collection that greeted her when she descended at the appointed hour. The room stretched upward through 3 full stories, its walls lined floor to ceiling with books. Rolling ladders provided access to the higher shelves, and galleries circled each level, allowing visitors to browse at their leisure. "You are impressed," the Duke said from somewhere behind her. Marian did not turn. She could not tear her eyes from the sight before her. "I am overwhelmed." "A rare admission from you, Miss Evermere." He moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and something deeper, earthier. Most guests glance at the room, offer some polite compliment, and never return. "I suspect you may be different." "How many volumes?" 12,000 at last count, though I confess the count was several years ago. The collection has grown since then. 12,000 books, more than she could read in a lifetime, even if she did nothing else. Marian felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight control she had maintained since arriving. This was not a room designed to impress. It was a room designed to be used, to be loved, to be inhabited by someone who understood the value of what it contained. "You are a reader," she said, and it was not a question. "I am many things, Miss Evermere. Reader is among the more respectable of them." He gestured toward a seating area near the massive fireplace, where comfortable chairs had been arranged around a low table bearing decanters and glasses. "Will you join me for a drink before dinner? I find that conversation flows more easily with refreshment." She followed him to the chairs, accepting the glass of wine he poured with a murmured thank you. The fire was warm, the wine was excellent, and the thousands of books surrounding them created a sense of intimacy that was entirely at odds with the vastness of the space. "You are wondering why I truly invited you here," the Duke said, settling into the chair across from hers. "The thought had crossed my mind. I told you the truth. Your refusal intrigued me. Your honesty intrigued me more." He swirled the wine in his glass, watching the firelight play through the deep red liquid. "I have spent 12 years hosting these Christmas gatherings, Miss Evermere. 12 years of watching the finest families in England parade through my home, all of them wanting something from me: money, influence, connections, a title for their daughters. Not once in all that time has anyone told me they found my invitations tedious. Perhaps they were simply more politic than I. Perhaps. Or perhaps they were simply more dishonest." His eyes met hers across the flickering light. "I find I have grown weary of dishonesty." There was something in his voice, a weariness that went deeper than mere fatigue, that caught Marian's attention. For the first time since meeting him, she glimpsed something beyond the commanding presence and aristocratic self-assurance. She glimpsed a man who might, despite all appearances, be as lonely as the gardens outside his window. "Why do you continue to host them then?" she asked. "If they bring you no pleasure, why persist?" "Because it is expected. Because my family has hosted this gathering for 5 generations. Because—" He stopped, and for a moment his mask slipped entirely, revealing something raw and uncertain beneath. "Because I do not know what else to do with myself during Christmas." The admission hung in the air between them, more vulnerable than anything she had expected from a man of his position. Marian found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by his unexpected candor. "You do not enjoy Christmas?" "I do not enjoy anything, Miss Evermere. I have not for some time." He seemed to catch himself, the mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. Forgive me. That was more revelation than polite conversation typically allows. I thought we had established that I have little use for polite conversation. A genuine smile flickered across his features, brief but unmistakable. So we did. Very well then. I will tell you a truth, and you may do with it what you will. I invited you here because you are the first person in longer than I can remember who has looked at me and seen something other than a title to be courted or an obstacle to be overcome. You looked at me and saw a man who could be challenged, questioned, disagreed with. You have no idea how refreshing that is. Marian considered his words carefully. You are surrounded by people who tell you what you wish to hear. I'm surrounded by people who tell me what they believe I wish to hear, which is not quite the same thing. They have constructed an image of the Duke of Ashworth, and they perform for that image without ever troubling to learn whether it bears any resemblance to the man himself. And does it? Does it what? Bear any resemblance to the man himself? He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before. I'm not entirely certain anymore. I have worn the mask for so long that I sometimes forget there is a face beneath it. The confession struck something deep within Marian, a chord of recognition that surprised her with its intensity. She understood masks. She had worn her own for years. The mask of the dutiful daughter who attended seasons and danced with suitors and pretended interest in matches she did not want. She had shed that mask only recently, and the freedom of it still felt new and fragile. Then perhaps, she said slowly, this Christmas might be an opportunity. An opportunity for what? To remember, to set aside the mask, even if only for a week, and discover who you are without it. The Duke stared at her with an expression she could not quite read. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the sharp planes of his face, the silver threads in his dark hair, the pale intensity of his eyes. He was, she realized with a start, quite extraordinarily handsome. Not in the soft, pretty way of the young men who had pursued her during her seasons, but in a way that spoke of strength and complexity and depths yet to be explored. You are a remarkable woman, Miss Evermere, he said finally. I am merely an honest one. In my experience, that is remarkable enough. Dinner that evening was an intimate affair, just the two of them at one end of a table designed to seat 30, attended by silent footmen who materialized and vanished like ghosts. The food was exquisite, the wine superb, and the conversation unlike any Marian had experienced in her years of social obligation. They spoke of books at first, authors they admired, works that had shaped their thinking, volumes they returned to again and again for comfort or inspiration. Marian discovered that the Duke's tastes were broader than she had expected, encompassing not only the classical education typical of his class, but also philosophy, natural science, and even poetry. You seem surprised, he observed, as they debated the merits of various romantic poets. I expected you to dismiss poetry as frivolous. Because I'm a duke? Because you are a man. In my experience, most men view poetry with suspicion, as though enjoying verse might somehow diminish their masculinity. The Duke laughed, that same genuine, unguarded sound she had heard in her family's entrance hall. I have never been particularly concerned with what others consider masculine. Life is too short to deny oneself pleasure simply because it might not be considered proper. A radical philosophy for a man of your position. Perhaps, or perhaps I have simply reached an age where pretense becomes more exhausting than honesty. He leaned back in his chair, regarding her with an expression of frank curiosity. May I ask you something personal, Miss Evermere? You may ask. I reserve the right not to answer. Fair enough. He paused as though gathering his thoughts. You have made clear your disdain for the marriage market and its machinations. But surely there must have been someone at some point who captured your interest. Someone who made you believe, even briefly, that partnership might be worthwhile. It was a question she had not anticipated, and it touched upon wounds she had long since learned to hide. Marian took a careful sip of wine before answering. There was someone. Once. What happened? He was not who I believed him to be, or rather, he was exactly who he was. I simply failed to see it until too late. She met the Duke's gaze steadily, refusing to flinch from the old pain. He was a second son with expensive tastes and no income to support them. He courted me quite skillfully, made me believe that he valued my mind and my opinions, and all the qualities that other suitors found inconvenient. And then I discovered that he was simultaneously courting an heiress with £30,000, and that his interest in me was merely a way to pass the time until she made her decision. The Duke's expression darkened. His name? It hardly matters now. He married his heiress and by all accounts has made her quite miserable. I consider my escape a fortunate one. But it wounded you. It taught me. Marian set down her wineglass with deliberate care. It taught me that words are easy, that charm can be manufactured, and that the only reliable guide to a person's character is their actions over time. 1 week of pretty speeches means nothing. 1 year of consistent behavior means everything. And so you have closed yourself off to the possibility of genuine connection. I have protected myself from manipulation. There is a difference. Is there? The Duke's voice was soft, almost gentle. It seems to me that both approaches end in the same place alone. The observation struck closer to home than Marian cared to admit. She had told herself that her solitude was a choice, that she preferred books to people, quiet to chaos, independence to partnership, and much of that was true. But there were moments, late at night or in the grey hours before dawn, when she wondered if she had built her walls so high that no one would ever scale them. Not that she would admit such doubts to the Duke of Ashworth. "I would rather be alone by choice than miserable in company," she said firmly. "Would you?" His eyes held hers with that unsettling intensity. "I have been both, Miss Evermere, and I can tell you that loneliness is loneliness, regardless of how one justifies it." Before she could respond, he rose from his chair and extended his hand. "Come, I wish to show you something." She hesitated for only a moment before accepting his offered hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and startlingly intimate, and he led her from the dining room through a series of corridors she had not yet explored. They emerged at last into a conservatory, its glass walls and ceiling revealing a star-strewn sky that seemed impossibly close. The room was warm despite the December cold, heated by some mechanism Marian could not identify, and filled with plants that should not have been blooming in winter, roses and jasmine and exotic flowers she did not recognize. "My mother's sanctuary," the Duke said quietly, releasing her hand. "She created this space when I was a child. After she died, my father wanted to tear it down. He found it too painful to see her work continuing without her. I convinced him to let it remain." Marian moved through the fragrant space, trailing her fingers across petals that seemed impossibly soft. "It's beautiful." She believed that beauty was essential to survival, not the beauty of gowns and jewels and social display, but the deeper beauty of growing things, of music, of connection between souls. He stood watching her, his tall form silhouetted against the starlight. "She would have liked you, I think." "Why?" "Because you are genuine. Because you speak truth even when it is uncomfortable. Because you refuse to perform for the approval of others." He paused. "She was much the same. It is why my father loved her so completely, and why her loss nearly destroyed him." There was old grief in his voice, carefully contained but still present. Marian felt the urge to offer comfort, though she did not know how. She who had spent years avoiding emotional entanglement, who had convinced herself that walls were stronger than bridges. "How long ago?" she asked softly. 18 years. I was 15. He moved to stand beside a climbing rose that had wound its way up a trellis, its deep red blooms incongruous against the winter darkness beyond the glass. This was her favorite. She planted it the year I was born. She used to say it would bloom for me when I needed it most. And does it? It blooms every December, without fail, whether I need it or not. His smile was sad. I choose to believe she was right. They stood together in the fragrant warmth, surrounded by impossible flowers and silence. Marian was acutely aware of his proximity, of the heat of his body beside hers, of the way his presence seemed to fill the space in a manner that was not oppressive, but somehow comforting. It was dangerous, this feeling. She had come here to prove her indifference, to demonstrate that neither grandeur nor charm could sway her conviction. She had not anticipated finding a man of depth and sorrow, and unexpected gentleness beneath the commanding exterior. She had not anticipated finding someone who made her want to lower her walls. "Thank you for showing me this," she said finally, not trusting herself to say more. "Thank you for seeing it." He turned to face her, and in the dim light of the conservatory, his eyes seemed almost silver. Most people look at this room and see only plants. You looked and saw memory, grief, love. You saw what it meant. I see what is there. Yes, his voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, you do. And I am beginning to wonder what else you might see, given time. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither of them named. Then, with visible effort, the Duke stepped back and offered a formal bow. "It is late, and you must be weary from your journey. I will escort you to your rooms." They walked in silence through the sleeping house, the only sound their footsteps on marble floors. When they reached the door to her suite, the Duke paused. "The other guests begin arriving tomorrow," he said. "The house will become considerably less peaceful, and considerably more tedious." He smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "We shall see. Perhaps you might reserve judgment until the week is complete." "Perhaps I might." "Good night, Miss Evermere." "Good night, Your Grace." She slipped into her rooms and closed the door behind her, leaning against it as though to barricade herself against the feelings swirling in her chest. Through the window, she could see the conservatory glowing like a jewel in the darkness, its impossible flowers blooming for a woman 18 years dead and a son who still mourned her. Duke Magnus Blackwood was not what she had expected, and Marian was no longer certain that was a bad thing. The guests began arriving the next morning, a steady stream of carriages disgorging lords and ladies and their assorted offspring onto the gravel drive. From her window in the east wing, Marian watched the parade with a mixture of curiosity and dread. She recognized some of the names announced by the butler, old families with ancient titles, their wealth evident in every gesture and garment. The women glittered with jewels even in daylight. The men carried themselves with the easy confidence of those who had never questioned their place in the world. Among them, she spotted several young women of marriageable age, each more polished and elegant than the last. The comparison to her own simple wardrobe was not flattering. "You are hiding." The Duke's voice came from the doorway of the small sitting room adjoining her bedchamber. Marian turned to find him leaning against the frame, watching her with an expression of amusement. "I am observing," she corrected. "There is a difference. You are avoiding the necessity of polite introductions and vapid conversation. I cannot say I blame you." He crossed to stand beside her at the window, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers. "It will only become worse as the week progresses. By Christmas Eve, there will be 40 guests competing for attention and advantage. You make it sound exhausting." "It is exhausting, but perhaps—" He turned to look at her, and there was something almost hopeful in his gaze. "Perhaps this year will be different. Because of me? Because of what you represent." He was silent for a moment, choosing his words with care. "You remind me that there are people in this world who value substance over show, who speak truth rather than flattery, who are not impressed by titles or wealth or the trappings of power." His mouth curved in a self-deprecating smile. "You remind me that I do not have to be merely the Duke of Ashworth. I can also be simply Magnus." It was the first time he had offered his Christian name, and the intimacy of it caught Marian off guard. She found herself unable to look away from his eyes, pale and searching in the winter light. "Magnus," she repeated, testing the weight of it. "My mother's choice. She said it meant great, and that she expected me to live up to it." His smile turned wistful. "I am not certain I have succeeded." "You are not certain of many things for a man of your position." "I am certain of very little, Miss Evermere, despite appearances to the contrary. But I am becoming certain of one thing." He reached out and very gently tucked a strand of escaped hair behind her ear. The touch sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. "I am becoming certain that meeting you was not an accident." Before she could respond, a footman appeared in the doorway with news that the Duke was urgently required below. Magnus, she could not help but think of him by that name now, withdrew his hand with evident reluctance. "Duty calls as ever, but I hope you will join me for dinner this evening. The full gathering will be present, and I find I'm curious to see how you navigate the social waters. You wish to see me flounder? I wish to see you triumph." His eyes held hers for a long moment. "I suspect you will." He departed, leaving Marian standing by the window with her heart beating faster than it should. She pressed a hand to the place where he had touched her hair, feeling the phantom warmth of his fingers. This was not supposed to happen. She was not supposed to feel whatever it was she was feeling. She had come here to prove her immunity to charm, her resistance to manipulation, her complete indifference to the entire aristocratic enterprise. She had not come here to fall in love with a duke. And yet, as she watched his tall form emerge onto the drive below to greet his arriving guests, she could not shake the terrible suspicion that falling was exactly what she was doing. The dinner that evening was everything Marian had dreaded. 40 guests arranged around the endless table, their conversation a constant hum of gossip and politics and social maneuvering. She had been seated by design or chance, she could not tell, between an elderly earl who spoke exclusively of hunting and a young baron who seemed unable to form a complete sentence without mentioning his estate's annual income. The food was exquisite and entirely wasted on her. She tasted nothing. The wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and raising voices until the room echoed with forced laughter and pointed remarks. Across the table, she watched young women flutter their eyelashes at eligible gentlemen, their mothers orchestrating every interaction with military precision. It was, in every way, exactly what she had expected, and yet her attention kept straying to the head of the table, where Duke Magnus Blackwood presided over the chaos with an expression of polished hospitality that did not quite reach his eyes. He nodded at appropriate moments, laughed at jokes that probably were not funny, and performed the role of perfect host with the ease of long practice. But occasionally, very occasionally, his gaze would find hers across the crowded room. And in those brief moments she saw something beneath the mask, something weary, something seeking, something that looked remarkably like recognition. After dinner, the company moved to the grand ballroom where musicians had been engaged to provide entertainment. The dancing began almost immediately, a swirl of silk and satin and practiced movements. Marian retreated to a corner near the refreshment table, hoping to escape notice. She did not succeed. Miss Evermere, is it not? The woman who approached her was perhaps 10 years her senior, dressed in the height of fashion, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her smile was perfectly pleasant and entirely calculated. "I am Lady Ashford. My husband is the Earl of Ashford. We are quite old friends of the Blackwood family." She positioned herself beside Marian with the air of one settling in for a lengthy interrogation. "I confess I do not believe I've encountered your family before. Tell me, how did you come to receive an invitation?" There it was, the question Marian had been dreading. She could lie, invent some connection that would satisfy curiosity, or she could tell the truth and watch the woman's expression curdle with disdain. She chose truth. She always did. "I refused the original invitation," Marian said calmly. "His Grace came to my family's home to inquire why. He was intrigued by my honesty." Lady Ashford's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "You refused an invitation from the Duke of Ashworth?" "I did." "And he invited you again?" "He did." A complex series of emotions played across the woman's carefully controlled features. Surprise, calculation, reassessment. Marian could practically see her recategorizing this unknown country girl from insignificant obstacle to potential threat. How unconventional of him. Lady Ashford's voice had cooled considerably. "The Duke is not typically drawn to novelty. I wonder what could have captured his attention so completely. Perhaps he grew weary of convention. Perhaps." The woman's smile had become something sharper, less pleasant. Or perhaps he is simply amusing himself with an unsuitable diversion before making a more appropriate choice. She gestured toward the dance floor, where several young ladies of impeccable breeding were competing for the Duke's attention. Lady Catherine, for instance, has long been considered a suitable match. Her family's connections are beyond reproach. Marian followed her gaze to a willowy blonde, executing the steps of a country dance with mechanical precision. She was beautiful in the way of expensive porcelain, perfect, polished, and completely devoid of warmth. "I wish her every happiness," Marian said, and was surprised to find she meant it. Lady Ashford's eyes narrowed. "You are remarkably calm for a woman who has so clearly set her cap at a duke." "I have set my cap at no one. I am here at His Grace's invitation, nothing more. I make no claims and have no expectations." "Then you are either lying or foolish. No woman comes to Blackwood Manor without expectations." "Then perhaps," Marian said quietly, "I am not like other women." She excused herself before Lady Ashford could respond, slipping through a side door and into a corridor that led away from the noise and press of bodies. The cool air was a relief after the overheated ballroom, and she leaned against the wall for a moment, gathering herself. Escaping already? The Duke emerged from the shadows, having apparently made his own exit from the festivities. In the dim light of the corridor, he looked tired, genuinely tired, in a way his public mask never allowed. "I required a moment of quiet," Marian said. "As did I." He moved to lean against the wall beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Lady Ashford can be formidable. You saw. I see everything that happens in my own home. It is both a privilege and a curse." He turned his head to look at her, and his expression was unreadable in the darkness. "I heard what you said, that you have no expectations. It is the truth. I know. That is what troubles me." "Why should it trouble you?" He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I find that I have expectations, Miss Evermere. Expectations I had not anticipated and do not entirely understand. And I am not certain what to do with them." Marian's heart stuttered in her chest. What expectations? I expected to find you interesting. I did not expect to find you essential." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the darkness. "I expected to prove a point, that my gathering was not as tedious as you believed. I did not expect to discover that everything is tedious without you beside me. Your Grace, Magnus, please." His voice was rough with emotion. "When we are alone, I am not the Duke. I am simply a man who has spent 12 years going through the motions of life without actually living. A man who had forgotten what it felt like to want something, truly want something, until you walked into my home and reminded me. She should pull away. She should maintain her carefully constructed defenses, remind herself of all the reasons why this could not, should not, would not work. A duke and a country gentleman's daughter. A man of immense consequence and a woman of no importance whatsoever. Society would never accept it. Her mother's dreams notwithstanding, such matches existed only in novels. But his hand was warm around hers, and his eyes were silver in the darkness. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Marian did not want to be sensible. "Magnus," she whispered, and watched his face transform at the sound of his name on her lips. He leaned closer, so close she could feel his breath against her skin. "Tell me to stop. Tell me this is madness, that we have known each other mere days, that everything about this is impossible. Tell me, and I will walk away." She should tell him. Every rational part of her mind was screaming that this was exactly the kind of manipulation she had sworn to avoid, the pretty words and heated glances that had deceived her once before. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw no deception. She saw only a man as lost as she was, reaching for something real in a world of artifice. "I cannot tell you to stop," she breathed, "when I do not want you to." The moment hung suspended between them, fragile as spun glass. Magnus's breath caught at her words, and in the dim light of the corridor, Marian saw something shift in his expression, hope warring with disbelief, desire battling with the caution of a man who had learned not to trust in happiness. "You cannot know what those words mean to me," he said, his voice rough. "Then tell me." He lifted his hand to her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "They mean that for the first time in longer than I can remember, I feel as though I am standing at the beginning of something rather than the end. They mean that the walls I built after—" He stopped, a shadow crossing his features. "After?" she prompted gently. Magnus was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old grief. I was engaged once, 7 years ago. Lady Eleanor Crane, beautiful, accomplished, everything a duchess should be. Our families had arranged it when we were children, and I believed we had grown to love each other. Marian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. What happened? She died. 3 weeks before our wedding, she took ill with a fever that no physician could cure. I sat by her bedside for 5 days, watching her slip away, powerless to stop it. His jaw tightened with remembered pain. After that, I stopped believing in the possibility of happiness. I performed my duties, hosted my gatherings, played the role that was expected of me. But I never allowed myself to feel anything real. It was safer that way. The confession illuminated so much, his weariness, his loneliness, the mask he wore with such practiced ease. Marian understood now why he had seemed so surprised by his own feelings, why he approached her with such cautious hope. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I cannot imagine such a loss. No one can until they experience it." He met her eyes, and there was a vulnerability in his gaze that stripped away every pretense of rank and power. "But you must understand, when I say that meeting you has changed something in me, I do not say it lightly. I had accepted that I would never feel this way again. I had made peace with a future of duty without joy, companionship without connection. And then you refused my invitation, and everything I thought I knew began to crumble. Because I said no, because you were honest, because you looked at me and saw not a title to be courted, but a man to be challenged. Because you reminded me that there are still people in this world who value truth over advantage." His thumb traced the line of her jaw, sending shivers down her spine. "You woke something in me that I thought had died with Eleanor, and I find I am terrified and grateful in equal measure." Marian's heart was beating so hard she was certain he must hear it. Everything she had believed about herself, her immunity to charm, her resistance to romantic entanglement, seemed suddenly fragile in the face of his raw honesty. "I am not Eleanor," she said. "I am not beautiful or accomplished, or anything a duchess should be. I am opinionated and difficult, and entirely unsuited to your world." "You are everything," Magnus said simply. "You are everything I did not know I was looking for." Before she could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor, someone approaching from the direction of the ballroom. Magnus stepped back, his expression shifting instantly to the polished mask of the Duke of Ashworth. "We should return," he said, though his eyes conveyed a different message entirely. "Tomorrow, perhaps, we might continue this conversation in more private circumstances." "Tomorrow," she agreed, her voice steadier than she felt. They returned to the ballroom separately, and Marian spent the remainder of the evening in a daze, responding to conversation without truly hearing it, dancing when asked without registering her partners. Her mind was consumed with Magnus's confession, with the feel of his fingers on her skin, with the terrifying and exhilarating realization that she was falling in love with a man she had known for mere days. It was madness. It was impossible. It was the most real thing she had ever felt. The days that followed were a delicate dance of stolen glances and hidden meanings. In public, Magnus played the perfect host, dividing his attention equally among his guests with the practiced ease of long experience. But Marian learned to read the subtle signs, the way his gaze would find hers across a crowded room, the slight softening of his expression when she spoke, the strategic seating arrangements that placed her near him at every meal. They found moments alone when they could. Early morning walks in the frost-covered gardens, late evening conversations in the library, while other guests retired to their rooms. Each encounter deepened the connection between them, revealing new facets of the man behind the title. She learned that he had studied mathematics at Cambridge and still solved complex equations for pleasure, that he corresponded with naturalists and philosophers across Europe, funding expeditions and research with the vast Blackwood fortune, that he had once considered abandoning his title entirely, disappearing into a life of anonymous scholarship, only to be recalled to duty by his father's illness. "I resented it for years," he admitted one evening, as they sat together in the conservatory surrounded by his mother's impossible flowers. The responsibility, the expectations, the endless performance. I told myself I was trapped, that I had no choice but to endure. And now? Now I wonder if the trap was of my own making. He turned to look at her, firelight dancing in his pale eyes. I could have made different choices. I could have sought connection rather than isolation, meaning rather than mere survival. Instead, I built walls and called them protection. We all build walls, Marian said quietly. The question is whether we are brave enough to tear them down. Are you brave enough? She considered the question carefully. A week ago she would have said no, would have insisted that her walls were necessary, that her solitude was chosen, that she wanted nothing from life beyond the quiet pleasures of books and independence. But a week ago she had not known Magnus Blackwood. I am beginning to think I might be, she admitted. His smile was like sunrise after a long winter night. Then we are both learning courage together. But not everyone at Blackwood Manor viewed their growing connection with approval. Lady Ashford had made it her mission to monitor Marian's every movement, and her sharp eyes missed nothing. By the third day, whispers had begun to circulate among the guests. Speculation about the Duke's unusual attentiveness to an unknown country girl, about the hours they spent in private conversation, about the impropriety of such obvious preference. "You are making yourself a subject of gossip," Lady Catherine said one afternoon, approaching Marian in the gallery where she had retreated to examine the paintings. The blonde beauty's voice was sweet as poisoned honey. "People are beginning to talk." "People always talk," Marian replied calmly. "It is their chief occupation at gatherings such as this." "You misunderstand me." Lady Catherine moved closer, her perfect features arranged in an expression of false concern. "I am trying to help you. The Duke is charming, certainly, and he has clearly been diverted by your novelty. But you must understand that men of his station do not marry women of yours. Whatever attentions he has paid you, they cannot lead anywhere respectable." Marian felt anger kindle in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "I have made no claims upon the Duke, Lady Catherine. I am merely a guest in his home. A guest who monopolizes his time and attention. A guest who disappears with him at odd hours. A guest who has clearly forgotten her place." The sweetness had drained from Lady Catherine's voice, leaving only cold disdain. "I have known Magnus since childhood. Our families have long anticipated a match between us. Whatever amusement you have provided, it will end when this week concludes and reality reasserts itself. Then you have nothing to worry about. I am not worried. I am merely ensuring that you understand the situation clearly." Lady Catherine smiled, and there was no warmth in it whatsoever. "Enjoy your week, Miss Evermere. It is all you will ever have." She swept away in a rustle of expensive silk, leaving Marian alone among the portraits of Blackwood ancestors. The words stung more than she wanted to admit, not because she believed Lady Catherine's claims of prior understanding with Magnus, but because they touched upon fears she had tried to suppress. What future could there be between them truly? A duke and a nobody, a man of vast consequence and a woman whose family could barely afford new gowns for the season. Society would never accept such a match. His peers would mock him, his family's legacy would be diminished, and Marian herself would become an object of scorn and pity, the upstart country girl who had presumed above her station. Perhaps Lady Catherine was right. Perhaps this week was all she would ever have. The thought was unexpectedly painful. That evening Magnus noticed her withdrawal immediately. "Something troubles you," he said, finding her in a quiet corner of the drawing room while other guests played cards and made conversation. "You have been distant all afternoon." "It is nothing. It is clearly something." He kept his voice low, mindful of the people around them. "Tell me." Marian hesitated, reluctant to reveal the source of her disquiet. But she had promised herself she would always be honest with him, and she would not break that promise now. "Lady Catherine spoke to me today. She informed me that my association with you is causing gossip, and that whatever attentions you have paid me cannot lead anywhere respectable." She met his eyes squarely. "She also informed me that your families have long anticipated a match between you." Magnus's expression darkened. "Did she? Is it true?" That our families have anticipated a match. Yes, my mother and hers were friends, and there has been speculation for years. But I have never encouraged it, and I certainly have never agreed to it. His voice was firm. Lady Catherine is beautiful and accomplished and entirely unsuitable for me. I realized that years ago, whatever her family's hopes might be. But she would be appropriate. A woman of her standing, her connections. Appropriate. The word emerged with something like disgust. I have spent my entire life doing what is appropriate, Miss Evermere. Marrying for advantage, hosting gatherings I despise, performing the role of duke with perfect precision. And it has brought me nothing but emptiness. He took her hand, heedless of who might see. You are the first person who has ever made me believe that I could have something real, something true. I will not sacrifice that for appropriateness. Magnus, listen to me. His grip tightened, his eyes burning with intensity. I know this is sudden. I know we have known each other mere days. I know that every rational consideration argues against what I am about to say, but I have learned that rational considerations are poor guides to happiness. Marian's heart was pounding. What are you about to say? That I am in love with you, completely, irrevocably, against all sense and reason. That I want you beside me, not for a week, but for a lifetime. That I do not care what society thinks, what my peers say, what anyone believes about appropriateness and station and proper matches. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her fingers. I want to marry you, Marian Evermere, and I am asking if you might want the same. The world seemed to stop. Around them, the drawing room continued its gentle hum of activity. Cards shuffled, glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell. But for Marian there was only this moment, this man, this impossible question. You cannot mean it, she whispered. I have never meant anything more. Your family. I have no family. My parents are dead. My brother died in infancy. And the distant cousins who would inherit if I produced no heir care nothing for me beyond my fortune. His voice softened. You would be my family, Marian. You and whatever future we might build together. Tears pricked at her eyes. Tears she had not shed in years, not since the day she had discovered the truth about the man who had deceived her. But these were not tears of grief or betrayal. These were tears of something she had forgotten how to feel. Hope. I am afraid, she admitted. I've been betrayed before. I have learned not to trust in pretty words and promises. How can I know? You cannot know. Not with certainty. Magnus's voice was gentle, understanding. All I can offer you is my word, my heart, and as much time as you need to believe in them. I will not rush you. I will not press you. But I will not hide my feelings or pretend they do not exist. And if I say no, then I will accept your decision and spend the rest of my life regretting that I could not convince you. He smiled, though there was pain beneath it. But I do not believe you will say no. I believe you feel what I feel, even if you are not yet ready to name it. He was right, she did feel it, this terrifying, exhilarating connection that defied everything she had believed about herself and her future. She felt it every time he looked at her, every time he spoke, every time his presence turned an ordinary moment into something extraordinary. But admitting it meant surrendering the walls she had spent years constructing. It meant trusting someone with her heart, her future, her very self. It meant accepting that she could be hurt again, perhaps worse than before. I need time, she said finally. Not to decide if I care for you, I know that I do, but to believe that this can work, that we can work. Take all the time you need. He released her hand gently. I am not going anywhere. Christmas Eve arrived with a flurry of activity. The manor had been decorated in its full festive glory. Evergreen boughs draped every banister, candles glittered in every window, and a magnificent tree stood in the great hall, adorned with ornaments that had been in the Blackwood family for generations. The guests assembled for the famous Christmas dinner, dressed in their finest attire, anticipation crackling in the air. Marian had chosen her best gown, a deep green silk that brought out the grey of her eyes, and descended the stairs with her heart in her throat. Magnus was waiting at the bottom, resplendent in formal black, his eyes finding hers immediately among the crowd. "You are beautiful," he said softly as she reached him. "You are biased. Utterly and completely." He offered his arm. "Will you do me the honor of sitting beside me at dinner?" "That will cause even more gossip. I find I no longer care about gossip." His smile was warm, almost boyish. "In fact, I intend to cause considerably more of it before the evening is through." The dinner was everything Blackwood Manor's reputation promised. Course after magnificent course, wine flowing freely, conversation sparkling. Marian sat at Magnus's right hand, a position of honor that raised eyebrows throughout the room. Lady Catherine's face was a mask of barely concealed fury. Lady Ashford's expression suggested she was already composing letters to every gossip in London. But Marian barely noticed them. Her attention was fixed on Magnus, on the way he included her in every conversation, sought her opinion on every topic, treated her as an equal partner rather than a social accessory. This, she realized, was what it could be. Not a performance of marriage, but a partnership of minds and hearts. Not a transaction of fortune and title, but a genuine meeting of souls. As the final course was cleared and the guests began to rise for the evening's entertainment, Magnus stood and raised his glass. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to their host. "My friends," he said, his voice carrying easily through the great hall, "I thank you for joining me for another Christmas at Blackwood Manor. As many of you know, this gathering has been a tradition in my family for 5 generations, and I am honored to continue it." Polite applause rippled through the assembly. "But this year," Magnus continued, "I have a special announcement to make, one that may surprise some of you, and will almost certainly provide fodder for gossip in the months to come." Marian's heart began to pound. He could not. "As you may have noticed, I have had the pleasure of hosting a very special guest this week. Miss Marian Evermere came to Blackwood Manor at my invitation, and in the days since her arrival, she has done something I thought impossible." His eyes found hers across the room, warm with love and certainty. "She has reminded me what it means to be truly alive." The room had gone utterly silent. Marian felt the weight of every gaze upon her, the shock and speculation and scandal rippling through the assembled guests. "I am aware that what I am about to say will be considered improper by some, precipitous by others, and utterly mad by most." Magnus's smile was serene. "I find I do not care. Miss Evermere, would you do me the honor of joining me?" Her legs moved without conscious decision, carrying her through the crowd to stand beside him. His hand found hers, warm and steady. "I have asked this remarkable woman to be my wife," Magnus announced. "She has not yet given me her answer, and I respect her need for time and certainty. But I wanted you all to know—" His voice strengthened, carrying a note of challenge. "I wanted everyone to know that my intentions are entirely honorable. Miss Evermere is not a diversion or an amusement. She is the woman I love, the woman I intend to spend my life with, and anyone who treats her with disrespect will answer to me personally." The silence stretched, pregnant with shock. Then, from somewhere near the back of the room, someone began to applaud. Others joined in, some enthusiastically, others with the mechanical politeness of social obligation. Lady Catherine had gone white as snow. Lady Ashford looked as though she had swallowed something extremely unpleasant, but Marian saw none of it. She saw only Magnus, his eyes bright with hope and love, and the courage of a man who had finally decided to stop hiding behind masks. "You are mad," she whispered, "entirely. This will cause a scandal. Without doubt. People will say terrible things about both of us. Let them." He raised her hand to his lips. "I have spent too many years caring what people say. All I care about now is what you say." The room held its breath, waiting for her response. Marian felt the weight of the moment, the magnitude of the choice before her. She could retreat, could claim she needed more time, could protect herself from the vulnerability of commitment, or she could be brave. "Yes," she said, and watched his face transform with joy. "Yes, I will marry you." The applause that followed was genuine this time, at least from some quarters. Magnus pulled her close, propriety be damned, and kissed her before the assembled company in a manner that would fuel gossip for years to come. And Marian, who had sworn never to trust in words or promises again, found that she believed in this one completely. Christmas morning dawned bright and cold, sunlight streaming through the windows of Blackwood Manor to illuminate a world transformed by overnight snowfall. Marian woke in her rooms in the East Wing, still half convinced that the previous evening had been a dream. But the ring on her finger, a magnificent sapphire that had belonged to Magnus's mother, proved otherwise. She was to be a duchess. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. A knock at her door proved to be Magnus himself, looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. He had abandoned his formal attire for simpler clothes, and his hair was slightly disordered as though he had been running his hands through it. "Happy Christmas," he said, his smile brilliant. "I hope you slept well despite the upheaval." "I slept better than I have in years," she admitted, "though I kept waking to check that the ring was still there. It is quite real, I assure you, as am I." He extended his hand. "Come, there is something I want to show you." He led her through the house, past servants who bobbed curtsies and offered congratulations, past the great hall where the magnificent tree still stood in its full glory. They emerged into the conservatory, where his mother's flowers bloomed in defiance of winter. But something had changed. Among the familiar roses and jasmine, a new plant had appeared, a small pot bearing a single white bloom, delicate as snow. "I had it brought from the greenhouse this morning," Magnus explained. "It is called a Christmas rose, though it is not truly a rose at all. It blooms only in winter, only in the coldest days when everything else has surrendered to the season." He turned to face her. "I thought it fitting." "Fitting? Because you are my Christmas rose, Marian. You appeared when I had given up hope, when I had resigned myself to eternal winter. You bloomed in the coldest part of my heart and reminded me that life continues, that spring always comes, that love is possible even when we have stopped believing in it." Tears pricked at her eyes, those unfamiliar tears that had returned since meeting him. "Magnus, I have one more gift for you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather-bound volume. "It is a first edition of your favorite poet. I noticed you reading it during your first evening here, and I thought—" She kissed him before he could finish, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. The book fell forgotten as his arms wrapped around her, pulling her close in the warmth of that impossible garden. "I love you," she whispered against his mouth. "I never thought I would say those words again, but I love you, Magnus Blackwood. And I love you, Marian Evermere." His voice was rough with emotion. "I will spend the rest of my life proving it." The wedding took place on New Year's Day, a small private ceremony attended only by Marian's parents and the few guests who had genuinely wished them well. Mrs. Evermere wept throughout, whether from joy or lingering shock no one could say. Harold Evermere shook Magnus's hand with quiet dignity and welcomed him to the family with the simple warmth that had always characterized him. The scandal, of course, was spectacular. For months, London talked of nothing else. The Duke of Ashworth and his unsuitable bride, the Christmas proposal that had shocked society, the rapid wedding that confirmed every whispered speculation. Lady Ashford sent letters to every acquaintance detailing the impropriety. Lady Catherine retreated to the country to nurse her wounded pride. But Magnus and Marian, ensconced in the comfort of Blackwood Manor, cared not at all. They had found what so many people spend lifetimes seeking, a partner who saw them truly, who valued honesty over performance, who loved not despite their flaws, but because of them. Their marriage was not the polished perfection of social expectation. It was something far more precious. It was real. Years later, when their children asked how they had met, Magnus would tell the story with evident relish. The refused invitation, the outraged visit, the slow discovery of a love neither had anticipated. "Your mother," he would say, eyes twinkling, "was the first person brave enough to tell me no, and it was the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." And Marian would smile, remembering the frightened young woman who had built walls around her heart, convinced that safety lay in solitude. She had been wrong. Safety lay in trust, in vulnerability, in the courage to believe that happiness was possible even after loss. She had come to Blackwood Manor expecting tedium and left with a love that would last a lifetime. It was, she reflected, the best Christmas gift she had ever received. The end. My dearest listeners, thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining me through all 3 parts of Marian and Magnus's beautiful story. What began with a refused invitation ended with a love that defied every expectation, and I hope their journey touched your heart as deeply as it touched mine. If you enjoyed this tale of courage, honesty, and Christmas magic, please take a moment to show your support. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story. There are so many more romances waiting to unfold. Leave a comment below and tell me your favorite moment from the story. Was it their first meeting, the conservatory confession, the Christmas Eve proposal? I would love to hear from you. Like this video to help other romance lovers find their way to our little corner of the internet. Turn on notifications so you'll know the instant a new story is ready for you. Your support means the world to me and helps me continue bringing you these beautiful tales of love and happily ever after. Until our next story together, may your days be filled with the same magic that Marian and Magnus found in each other. With all my love and warmest wishes for your own happy ending, until next time, sweet listeners.